the Moneyweb Crypto Podcast, where we discuss all things crypto related. Your host, Kieran Ryan.
There's been plenty speculation about the potential impact of quantum computing on the Bitcoin network. Google recently ran a calculation on its quantum chip in 5 minutes that would take the world's fastest supercomputer 10 septillion years to complete. If you've never heard that word before, septillion, that's longer than the entire age of the universe. So quantum computing is both fascinating and potentially terrifying. It means we will soon be able to design drugs in weeks, not years, and make smarter, faster investment decisions. In essence, this makes AI's admittedly impressive advancements look minuscule compared to what's coming. There's been speculation that quantum computing poses a threat to Bitcoin's cryptography. How real is this threat, and is the Bitcoin community taking steps to address this? Well, to answer that, we're joined by an old familiar guest of ours, Rob Price, founder and CEO of Sound Money. Hi, Rob. Thanks again for your time. In a recent article, you addressed this issue of quantum computing and the threat to Bitcoin. Explain what is quantum computing, and is this in fact a threat to Bitcoin?
Fantastic, Kieran. Great to be with you as always. As you mentioned, quantum computing is a new type of computing which uses the principles of quantum mechanics. And in theory, that could solve problems way faster than the classical computers, and it's this sudden explosion, of course, in artificial intelligence that has led many to speculate that a time horizon to widely available and stable. I'm sure we'll get onto some points about that time horizon, and in terms of the threat to Bitcoin. Well, Bitcoin is a digital technology that is reliant on cryptography. And there are a number of cryptographic algorithms in Bitcoin. But the key one that we'll talk about here is elliptical curve digital signature algorithm, or CDSA. And that is a critical component in Bitcoin. It governs the relationship between private keys and public keys. And this is very common in cryptography to have this two-key pair. And obviously, I'm going into a little bit of technical detail, but I encourage listeners, to just, take some time to learn a little bit more of the Bitcoin technicals. Don't worry, we won't go deep down the rabbit hole. I'm not a cryptography expert myself. But yes, Bitcoin has these two key pairs, and the private keys, those are the ones that, of course, kept private. They're used for signing transactions, and they are, of course, linked to the public key. The public key is used for verifying transactions and for receiving assets. And you can very easily derive the public key from the private key. But with current computing, it is incredibly difficult and improbable to derive the private key from the public key. And I said this is very critical to Bitcoin security, because when spending transactions, the public key is published on the blockchain. And the fact, of course, that we can't derive the private key from the public key, it keeps Bitcoin secure. But in the advent of quantum computing, we could imagine a world where it becomes easier, potentially frivolous, to derive the private key from the public key. As I said, it's obviously not the case at the moment, but if that were to be the case, then you could imagine a situation where people are able to hack and spend Bitcoin transactions. And I'll go into a little bit more technical detail here, just because I think it's useful to note this does highlight a common practice in Bitcoin that is often used, is to always use a new receive address whenever receiving funds. Usually this is done in order to enhance privacy, but in the advent of quantum computing, there will be a difference between those wallets that have, or those addresses that have capital spent from, and those that have not. Because, of course, those that have not had capital spent from, they won't be publishing the public key on the blockchain, and therefore actually could have an additional security mechanism. So once again, I know I'm going into a little bit of detail here, but that's just a useful common practice that I think people should be aware of. Anybody who's kind of securing their own Bitcoin, they should have a high quality wallet, and thereafter they should be always, when receiving funds, using a new receive address, because it provides an additional security mechanism. But yes, high level, the threat to quantum computing is that it could at some point break Bitcoin's public key, private key.
All right. Now, I guess the real question is, how is the world preparing for this potential threat? And are there quantum-resistant technologies out there or in development that will safeguard the network into the future?
Yes, I think the key point that you've made there is, how's the world preparing for this threat? Because, while I've obviously outlined the threat to Bitcoin, it's very important to note that all security systems, digital security systems, rely on cryptography. They all utilize these hashing algorithms. So banks, insurance companies, national security agencies, they're all reliant on cryptographic algorithms. And in the advent of quantum computing, they will all come under threat. And so, that's just important to understand that this, of course, is not a Bitcoin alone threat. And, in the advent of quantum computing, it's also, I think, useful to speculate that there would be other pools of capital or other pools of information that potentially could be greater honeypots than, Bitcoin itself. Because, Bitcoin is obviously growing. It's a $2 trillion asset. But that's still kind of tiny in relative to other pools of capital in the world. Because this is such a big global threat to be aware of, something into the future. So once again, we need to contextualize it. But the world is obviously very well aware of this. So in the US, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, the NIST, they actually ran a multi-year competition from 2016 to 2022 to identify post-quantum or quantum-resistant cryptographic algorithms, and they had lots of entries, and they came up with a number of best candidates, of which there is a list. And so the conclusion here is that all cryptography could be upgraded. Bitcoin's hashing algorithm can be upgraded. The question is more about and maybe the greater challenge is about what upgrading these systems look like and what the threats are in doing so.
It makes little sense that someone would want to use the huge amount of resources that would be required to crack Bitcoin. You mentioned it's a $2 trillion asset at the moment, and it burns such an enormous amount of energy. Is this a realistic threat?
Yeah, I think there are 2 points to make here. Is one, Bitcoin, as you've mentioned, is a $2 trillion asset. That's obviously, grown substantially over the last, 10, 15 years. But it's still incredibly small relative to other pools of assets. So, you could envisage that in the hypothetical scenario where quantum computing were to emerge in the short term, that technology, if it was used by nefarious actors, would more likely be turned towards, banks, insurance companies, national security agencies. I think it's also important to highlight that while the advent of artificial intelligence has brought the timeline towards eventual stable quantum computing forward, our best guess is that it's still quite some way away. Realistic experts are still casting 10 to 50. And I think it's also important to note that quantum computers do actually exist today. It's just that they're not reliable. They're still noisy. They're error prone. So there's still a long way to go. And even when they do come into being, it's more likely, or seems more likely, that they would be targeted towards bigger pools of capital or more important pieces of information.
If it came to it and Bitcoin had to make adjustments, what would those adjustments look like?
All right. So, this really gets to the crux of it, Kieran. The reality is that all security systems utilize cryptography. They're all going to need to upgrade eventually. And the key question here is the differences of upgrading a centralized system versus a decentralized system. So in a centralized system, I don't want to trivialize software upgrades. Of course, it's a significant process and there's all sorts of testing behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, an individual or a group of individuals can flip a switch and decide to move that system in that direction. Whereas Bitcoin is decentralized, it needs to generate consensus. And that's, of course, by design. We don't want Bitcoin to be easy to change. We don't want significant changes in this important monetary technology, this potential reserve asset of the world that is so powerful. We don't want to be debating what the money supply schedule is on a month-to-month basis. So changing the algorithm should be hard. And then maybe another technical detail just to touch on here briefly, usually Bitcoin tries to upgrade software in what we call a soft fork. Now, don't worry about the terminology. All that means is that, when conducting an upgrade, the old software speaks to the new software. So, things like SegWit, things like Taproot, if you're not using the SegWit addresses, the old addresses still speak to the Bitcoin network appropriately, and there's no confusion. Whereas if you're doing something more structural in nature, you could imagine that it might require a hard fork, and that won't be backwards compatible, that old versions of the software might not speak to new versions of the software. And generally, Bitcoin tends to view hard forks as undesirable because they're not backwards compatible and because there might be some degree of confusion. And therefore, I think the conclusion of this conversation is that, we need to be prepared mentally for this. As I said, this threat exists. It's probably a bigger threat for most other, security systems around the world. But the reality is that Bitcoin is a decentralized system, and so it is more difficult to upgrade. And so we need to prepare ourselves. We need to generate consensus. I don't lose sleep over quantum computing, but we need to prepare for the day when quantum computing does exist and know which algorithm it is we're changing to, how we're going to do that, and so that all the participants in the network, from nodes to miners to holders to merchants, are all ready to move in a suitable direction when that day does arrive.
Well, it's good to know that the future of Bitcoin has been given some thought and there's some appropriate planning taking place. Rob Price, I want to thank you very much for joining us on the Moneyweb Crypto Podcast and look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thanks again, Kieran.
Thanks for listening to the Moneyweb Crypto Podcast, hosted by Kieran Ryan. To listen to our other podcasts, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates.